Hello and welcome to India's World. Today we are going to discuss Russian President Vladimir Putin's leadership and his confrontation with the West, in the latest instance over eastern Ukraine. Many believe that Putin has restored Russian pride and enhanced Russia's power. They claim that he saved Russia from the economic decline which began in the Yeltsin years and that he increased Russia's sense of worth internationally. Others, especially his critics in the West, claim that his policies have been regressive and reckless. They say that after initial years of growth, he has weakened the Russian economy and that his Ukraine misadventure, especially after the shooting down of Malaysian Airlines flight MH17, has isolated Russia globally. To discuss Putin's leadership and its future, we have with us three experts on Russia, two ambassadors and one subject expert and a journalist who's worked in Moscow. We have with us Ambassador Prabhat Shukla. He was India's ambassador to Russia, High Commissioner of Singapore and Australia. He is currently a distinguished fellow with the Vivekananda International Foundation, a think tank in Delhi. Ambassador Ajai Malhotra, he is former ambassador to Russia again. He also represented India at the UN, was ambassador to Romania and Kuwait, and a distinguished fellow currently at the Energy Research Institute, TERI, in New Delhi. And my old friend Nandan, Unnikrishnan, who served as Chief of Bureau of the Press Trust of India in Moscow, but lived, I think, a longer part of his life in Moscow than those 3 years. He's Vice President and Senior Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, a think tank in Delhi, and he's head of the Eurasian Studies program. So I welcome all of you to this discussion. Mr. Shukla, let me begin with you. Is Putin's wide acceptance as a leader a reaction to the disastrous years of Yeltsin, under whose rule Russian economy went under and Russia lost stature globally?
I think that would largely be true. And, you know, Putin himself actually announced at one of his first speeches after taking over as president that when Yeltsin handed power over to him, he said to him, "Save Russia," which tells you two things. One, that Yeltsin himself realized how wrong his policies had been. And secondly, that he depended on Putin to set things right. Now, you know, people wonder why Putin is so popular in Russia today. And the reason is that most of them do remember the decade of the 90s. You know, they have a historical term called time of troubles. The last time they had a time of troubles was when the Rurik dynasty collapsed in the early 17th century. And it was brought back on track by the Romanov dynasty. So they are equating it with that kind of trouble which Russia has been facing. And Putin certainly has stabilized society. He has cleaned crime off the streets. And partially, I think, thanks to a very benevolent international economic environment, he has revived the Russian economy as well. So his popularity is entirely understandable. And with all that, he has given Russia a sense of pride and self-worth, which had completely disappeared after the breakup of the Soviet Union.
Okay. Ambassador Malhotra, but there are critics of Putin who say that he rules Russia almost as a dictator, that he has defeated and intimidated his opponents, and that he's become a threat to the surrounding countries, the countries that surround Russia. Do you agree with this view?
I would not entirely agree with this view.
But partially...
First of all, no. Let me first of all say that what Prabhat said is entirely correct. President Putin, as president, had the advantage also of a period of 8 years when oil and gas prices were high and the world economy was booming. If you see the following 4 years, you had in 2008 the economic crisis which affected the world. And fortunately for him, it was a period when Medvedev was president and he was the prime minister. But no, it would not be correct to say that he has been forward in looking for a fight or picking a fight with others. I think he realizes that his main effort has to be to make a strong, stable and prosperous Russia. And that is what he's trying to devote his attention to. And it would not be correct, even if you look at Ukraine and Crimea, these are not issues that were started by Putin or adventures that went wrong, which Putin began. So I would be a little hesitant in...
But what you're saying is that the economic growth was taking place in any case. Circumstances were propitious not only for Russia, but also the surrounding republics, because if you look at their growth figures, they were also growing at a time when Russia started growing.
Yes, but leadership makes a difference. And a strong leader like Putin, I think, did make a difference. And it would, again, a point you asked a little earlier, let's be fair. He won the last election in 2012 fairly handsomely. He won in every single constituency, almost 80 odd across Russia. And so it isn't as if, and you could say that some prospective candidates had been kept out due to the way the system was arranged. But the point is there were 5 or 6 other candidates and all. So he did win up there. And even now, I think he has a fairly high level of support in any poll that is taken across Russia, whether by Westerners or by Russian pollsters.
Okay. And then let me ask you a slightly different question. There was a time not too long ago when Russia's relationship with Europe was flourishing. Russia had got very close to Germany. And then suddenly everything went wrong. So how did all this happen?
Well, I think Ajay touched upon one aspect of it, which is, of course, a lot of tension has arisen after the Ukrainian crisis. But here I think it has to be repeatedly emphasized that the Ukrainian crisis wasn't engineered by Putin, as it is nowadays depicted, particularly in the mass media. It was something that started elsewhere, and there are other people who perpetrated, if you want, regime change.
We're going to discuss that in greater detail.
So therefore, but the tragic point, I think, where it really, the divergence between Europe and Russia came, and where Europe reluctantly agreed to back United States' third phase of sanctions, was probably the downing of the Malaysian Airlines aircraft, which was a real tragedy. And we still don't know who did it, although I guess most people would agree that, or would believe that it was brought down by the separatists. But if you're asking me, is there any single point at which this divergence occurred, I would think that is the point of divergence.
Would you not trace it back to Russia's success till Syria? Here was America being absolutely reckless, wanting to bomb Damascus, and Russia, which came across as a responsible power, persuaded everybody that negotiation was the better way. So Russian stature was rising, and America was seen as feckless and reckless. So do you think that had something to do with starting this sort of nascent Cold War between Russia and the West?
No, I would not think so. Listen, I think there are clear linkages between what is happening in the greater Middle East and what is happening north of the Black Sea. Certainly there are links. But I would argue that the dynamic in Ukraine has more to do with Western expansion into the former Soviet Union space. Now, it is a well-known fact that back in the early 90s, when the Soviet Union had collapsed and they were discussing new territorial arrangements, an assurance had been given to Gorbachev, and Gorbachev has said this in public, and it has not been contradicted by anybody, and he told me this himself personally, that he had been given an assurance that NATO would not expand eastwards. Now we see not only that it has expanded eastwards, but that Ukraine, particularly, Georgia as well, remain candidates for NATO membership. Now, you know, everyone has heard this famous speech by Churchill about the riddle, enigma, mystery. But you know, if you read the whole speech, he says something very remarkable. Not only does he say that, you know, there is a key to understanding Soviet behavior, he uses the term Russian even then. And he says it's national interest. And he mentions two things which are vital to Russia's national interests. The first, he says, is the Balkans. And you see how through the 90s, Russian interest and Russian concerns were consistently and militarily undermined in the Balkans. Second thing he says is German presence on the Black Sea. Now, if you transpose it to the current context, it would mean a NATO presence on the Black Sea. is a vital Russian interest. And so that is really what they have been trying to defend. And the Crimea and Sevastopol are critical to Russia's presence over there.
We're going to discuss this more in the next section, so please allow me to take a short break.
Sure.
We need to take a break just now. We'll be back again in a bit. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing Putin's leadership and his future in Russia. Ambassador Malhotra, did the developments in Ukraine convince Putin that the Western powers wanted to destroy the Russian Federation just as the Soviet Union had been destroyed, not necessarily by Western powers, but that they want a breakup of the Russian Federation? And why is Russia so scared of Ukraine, which has Western influence?
Well, I think that's linked with your previous question. And I would date the moment when all of this started to change was when Putin was re-elected. That means 2012, really April. In fact, if you see from 2009 to 12, when you had Medvedev as the president, you had what was known as a reset in US-Russia relations. But 2012 April, it was what was known as pressing of the delete button. And from then it was a steady deterioration. If you see the ballistic missile deployment of systems in Europe, if you see the Magnitsky Act, if you see the push and shove that went with it, throwing out of USAID and NATO expansion, as Prabhat had mentioned. So all of these are factors that have been working in a particular direction, really seeking to curtail the space available to Putin. Certainly Ukraine, yes, it wasn't an issue of his creation. If you look at December last year, they had more or less tied up a $15 billion loan to the Ukrainians, and things seem to be moving in a particular direction. And then you had all the issues that came up in the Maidan, etc., which certainly seemed to be motivated by his opponents. And if you see how things thereafter developed, really MH17 and its implications were to bring the Atlantic Alliance, bring USA and Europe together. And there are 2 or 3 implications of what happened up there. Firstly, there were many Dutch citizens who died. And that was important because amongst Russia's trading partners, the Germans and the Dutch are high in the ranking amongst the Europeans. And certainly it had an impact back home on Dutch politics. And secondly, even for the Germans, I think the way they showed the bodies strewn around, belongings lying all over the place, even though the Germans were in discussions with the Russians to try and find a solution. And that was really the Russian proposal when you had the troubles on the Maidan and Kiev, that we must find a solution, a working compromise through discussions between Russia, Ukraine, and the EU. This was no longer possible. And I think the West, in its alliance between USA and EU, thereafter started putting pressure on Putin in a particular direction, which continues till now, through sanctions and bans, etc.
Nandan, if the Ukrainian uprising had not happened, engineered or otherwise, do you think Putin would have been able to create a division between Europe and the US?
No, I don't think that a division between Ukraine and between Europe and the US would be possible at any point of time.
But their energy dependence on Russia would be such that Russia would be a close partner of Europe.
No, but what would have happened is that if, let's say, an agreement was arrived at to create Ukraine as another, let's say, Finland, I mean, just as an example, I think peace in Europe would have prevailed and you would have found greater cooperation between Russia and the West. But again, unfortunately, this whole thing about regime change, the charge that is being put forth by some nationalist elements in Russia, that the US is intent on regime change, is unfortunately not without merit. So I think whether Russia wants or doesn't want, it has to protect what it would consider its national interest. And this is where the problem arises. How do you define what the Russians see as their national interest and what the West sees as their natural interest. The twain shall never meet, as it were.
All right. Shukla, do you think the bringing down of the Malaysian Airlines MH17 flight was really the critical point which tipped the perception of the West about Putin? Before that, he was seen as an effective leader, strong leader, rational leader, although ruthless. And after the bringing down of MH17, suddenly he was seen as somebody who was reckless, who was irresponsible, irrational, that, you know, he probably, there are charges that he probably supplied surface-to-air missiles to these rebels. Some people say it's a sophisticated system, so either the Russians were operating the system or the rebels had been trained by him. Now, why would Putin behave in this fashion? Why would he put himself in such a position? Or do you think it happened quite accidentally?
No, I think that's a very good question, and the honest truth is we don't have the complete story yet. But I agree with you that the downing of MH17 was the turning point. To me, it was very reminiscent of the shooting down of the South Korean airliner in 1983, KAL 007. The difference, of course, was that time the Soviet Union admitted that they had shot it down because it was in Soviet airspace. Today, we don't really know, and to be quite honest, I have tried to analyze this. What interest of the Russians has been achieved by this? None at all. It could be a mistake, a genuine mistake, because the Ukrainian Air Force was flying in the region. We also know that the Ukrainian Air Force planes were flying at the same time. So the reality is that this would require more study to get to the facts. But frankly, today it's too late.
Okay.
Public opinion in Europe seems to have been swayed by this killing. Yeah. And particularly, I would say, the aftermath. You know, the fact that the rebels would not allow access to the crash site seemed to bespeak a certain sense of guilt. And I think that is what was played upon very effectively to cleave European opinion behind the American narrative, which, as you have correctly noted earlier, wasn't entirely selling in all of Europe. Okay. So I think MH17 was a turning point.
Okay, thank you. We need to take a break again at this point. We'll be back again in a bit. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing Putin's leadership of Russia. Mr. Shukla, you wanted to add something to whatever you were saying.
Yeah, I want to add this, that, you know, despite the shooting down of the MH17, I am noticing a remarkable amount of restraint, actually, on the part of the Russians. The rebels have asked for a truce because the Ukrainian army has got them surrounded, even in Donetsk, and that is really their head office, headquarters. And the Russians are standing by. The reason is that I don't believe Putin wants Ukraine to be destabilized or worse, broken up. And it's only if he is goaded beyond a point that they will be forced to react. And I hope we don't come to that.
Well, let's hope so. Ambassador Malhotra, do you think that the general economic crisis in Russia, you know, declining GDP growth rate for a few years now, plus the central bank has said zero growth rate this year, the capital flight from Russia, the first 6 months this year, the flight of capital has been more than for whole of 2013, decline in FDI, coupled with Putin's inability to control the Ukraine situation, do you think it could hasten Putin's exit?
I think politically he is not on such a weak wicket at the moment, but things could change. Yes, economics is very important, but for the Russian people now they see it as Russia under threat and the West really trying to, play in, to muddy the water for the Russians. So there will be a groundswell of support for anything he might do, which might make it difficult for the West to proceed in a direction they would want. But certainly, an economy which is not functioning too well, and the Russian economy is not doing particularly well at the moment, can be a complication that is not desirable.
Nandan, do you think, if there is a change in leadership in Russia, do you think such a change will happen through democratic structures, or would it happen in the old Soviet Union style, that the people you trust the most are the ones who betray you first?
Now, You're asking me to be an astrologer. That is really
look into
very...
the future as an analyst.
That is really very difficult. One is, it'll depend on what causes the tipping point. What is the catalyst that brings it to a point where leadership change is even considered? Today, the elite is so entrenched and has invested in Putin as being the supreme judge who will resolve the differences between them and all, that I don't see particularly the business elite today opting for regime change or any kind of change. That's one. Point two, the majority of workers, particularly the blue-collar workers, barring a few elements maybe in Moscow and St. Petersburg, are invested in Putin because he's the man who dragged them out of the situation where they weren't paid salaries. He's the one who's brought them stability. So they, political, as Ajay mentioned, the political support for him at this point is very strong. So whether regime change occurs or not will depend on what the catalyst is. Like MH17 was the black swan, in a sense, in the discussion with Europe. Unless some kind of black swan event occurs, I do not see regime change.
Do you agree? Do you agree, Ambassador Shukla, with what Nandan Unnikrishnan is saying, or do you think Putin is not in trouble domestically?
No, look, I think the combination of a bad economy and global isolation does affect a very significant part of the Russian elite, and one should watch very carefully the internal dynamics in the country. But there is one angle that I think is worth adding each time we talk about Russia and Putin in particular. You know, the more he is squeezed by the West, and let's face it, Russia is being cornered, the more they are forced to rely on China. That is not in our interests. And you know, you can see it in many different ways. Of course, diplomatically, politically, every way, but also in this new gas deal that they signed with the Chinese, they've accepted a price which is about $100 less per 1,000 cubic meters than they are charging in Europe. Now, these are very clear signs that even he is not comfortable in the Chinese embrace, and I really believe that India has a role to play here. India has a role to play because we are trusted both by the Americans and the Russians, very quiet, with a lot of spade work done in advance. I think it's worth checking out whether there is any common ground worth pushing towards.
Okay. Mr. Malhotra, is there any common ground? Can India do something to diffuse this crisis and prevent Russia getting isolated?
I would agree with what Prabhat has said. You know, it is in our interest to have a strong and stable Russia which is proceeding, which fulfills its international obligations. I think that is in India's interest too, if not, in fact, in the interest of the world at large. And anything that we can do to move it in that direction is very important. And if you see the Ukraine issue, you cannot find a political solution there without Russia. Let's be very clear about that. Even if they take Donetsk and Luhansk, etc., the Ukrainian armed forces, that issue can continue to fester and probably will, because that's not a solution. So I think the way ahead is to encourage consultation and discussions, like in fact the Russians had proposed earlier, that bring the EU, bring Ukraine, bring Russia, if you need one or two more to create a phalanx and sit around a table, that's the only way to go forward. Okay. The way forward is not through use of force, but through cooperation, consultation.
Nandan, so what are the choices before Putin? One is, of course, negotiation. But can he retreat from Ukraine and let it slip under Western influence? Or do you think that one choice, which we haven't really discussed, is that he becomes more aggressive both abroad and at home?
Well, you know, all scenarios are open at this stage. I would say that I will not rule out the possibility that he may be pushed into attempting to either become more aggressive, as you put it, you know, moving into eastern Ukraine. I still believe that Russia's interest is best served, and I think the Russians at the level of the leadership also recognize it, that their interests are served best by getting everyone to a table to discuss this issue. You know, I think they will pursue that. But if push comes to shove, it would be difficult to predict how it will go.
Okay, last word to you. What are the choices?
I would go further.
Will he invade Eastern Ukraine?
I would go further and say yes. He cannot be seen to lose Ukraine. And you know, last Thursday, I think it was, that the NATO Secretary General was in Kiev and offering assistance and advice. This is a Russian nightmare, not just Putin's, but a Russian nightmare. And I can't see that Putin will back down.
Okay.
So I would say, yes, he's going to fight this.
Okay, all right. We've run out of time. I would like to thank all of you, Nandan, Ambassador Malhotra, Ambassador Shukla, for coming here and participating in this discussion. That's all we have for you today. We'll be back again next week with another interesting issue. Till then, goodbye and thanks for watching.